children of all ages, friends from near and afar, I want to thank you for being part of our services here tonight. And I understand that you just watched a video of Dr. David Barton about Columbus and the history of Columbus. Our guest this evening flew in from on American Airlines, and from what I understand, there's a bad case of freedom flu going around in the airlines, and you may have heard about some of those. So I don't know if the freedom flu affected that necessarily, but so we got here. Their flight was delayed about 90 minutes from their intention of getting here, and so fortunately we have friends in the police department that helped us get here quickly. But yeah, so funny. So anyways, I wanted you. I know that you came here. Many of you were here 40 minutes ago for the start of it, but I wanted you to at least get a little taste of some of the things that impacted me. When I was 13 years old, I was introduced to Dr. David Barton's ministry, and it really impacted me as a love for this country and a love for our foundations and our heritage. He impacted me as a young man, and I'm so thankful for what God has done in this country and how God has used him. So tonight, he is traveling with another friend of mine. His name is Chad Connelly, and I don't know if we have any Republicans in here. Do we have any Republicans in here? I think it's okay to say that tonight. So Chad worked for the Republican National Convention for several years. In fact, he traveled around the country talking about the need for evangelicals to be involved in the political system. And he's traveling tonight with Dr. Barton. He's going to come introduce Dave. And Dave knows that we're already 40 minutes late, so he wants to just share with you some things. And I don't know all that they have planned. You're welcome to leave at any time you want. You're welcome to stay as long as you want. But I want to introduce my friend, Chad Connelly.
Y'all have an awesome pastor. I am so honored to be here. You know, I was telling somebody when I came in, we like takeoffs and landings to equal, right? And so we don't want to complain about delays that are mechanical, but I'm so honored to be here. I love the Tice family. Don't y'all love them? We need leaders like that all over America. How many of y'all think it's a mess out there? We need to get Christians involved in every arena. And so I'm just really excited to be here. This is meeting number 30 out of what's going to be something like 44 in 16 different states, because we're committed to the idea that Christian votes don't just need to be heard, but Christian voices need to be heard. From dog catcher to president, city council, school boards, for goodness sakes, we're getting our teeth kicked in, and it's our fault because it's our responsibility. And so I'm going to get David up here as fast as possible. As soon as he says that he's good to go on his program, I'm going to roll. But I grew up in a little town called Prosperity, South Carolina. There's a famous road sign that says Clinton to the left and Prosperity to the right. And so I got it bad. Every presidential candidate that's on the American side that's come through, I've taken them by that sign. They're like, is that real? Yes, sir, it is. Let's go by there. And so, but I grew up just wanting to be involved. I went in the Army. It made me appreciate America and realize people died so we would have this thing called freedom. America is so great. Amen. And I never had to be shot at, thankfully, but it made me appreciate that some people died for this thing called freedom. Our nation's so great that people who hate us won't leave. That's incredible. That's incredible. You know, if y'all were in a bad place and a negative person, you know, when they walk in, the sunshine leaves kind of thing, you leave, right? You don't deal with that stuff. And appreciate your service, brother. And I know it's more military people out here. And so I started getting involved in politics. Poly's many, tick means bloodsuckers. I didn't want to do it, but I knew it was important, and it was watching people like David Barton that gave me my fire. I started an organization called Faith Wins when I left the Republican National Committee. I got to work for a guy named Trump in 2016, and we maximized the vote of the evangelicals. And I've spent my entire career saying Christians get involved. And when you hear David Barton, you're going to, number one, say, I wish more of my friends heard him. And you're going to want to get his book and read it and pass it along. And number two, you're going to say, what have I got to do next? And so when he gets done, he's going to put this slide back up. I'm actually going back to the airport. I have not been home 2 nights in a row for a month. And I'm home for 3 nights after this trip because we know, y'all, we're losing the country. We're losing the country because we as Christians have not done our Matthew 5 salt and light obligation to be involved. We've worn our little stickers that say I voted, and it's not good enough anymore. So our organization called Faith Wins, when I left the RNC, I think I was the only senior staffer not to go work in the White House. I started this 501c3 to continue to engage Christians and to teach them how to get involved. So when he gets done, you're going to say, what can I do? I want you to hold your camera up to that little QR code, they call it. If you don't know how that works, find a 12-year-old and they'll teach you. And hold it up, and it'll go to a thing that you'll click, and it'll say, I want to be a poll watcher. I want to hold voter registration in my church. I know the Tices do that. Some of y'all go to churches that don't. We try to make it easy for you because Christian voices and votes need to be maximized throughout America. This is not the only time we're going to come. Last year we did 89 in-person meetings in 15 states with 2,965 pastors. My goal this coming year is to have 2.5 million new evangelicals registered. We registered just under 750,000 new evangelicals last year, and it's not enough. But we were in the middle of a pandemic, right? And so we went all over the place. So this year, my goal was to teach Americans that God's role in this nation is irreplaceable. Without the Lord in it, you don't have America. You don't have religious freedom. And it is just my greatest honor to introduce you to somebody that's been a mentor, a friend. He and Cheryl are unbelievable. We've been traveling around the country, running to and fro. But I want you to give an awesome Las Vegas welcome to America's greatest historian, David Barton.
Thank you, Matt. Thanks, Chad. It's always good to be with Chad. I want to start tonight just with a simple word, and that word is history. Particularly from a biblical standpoint, the Bible says very clearly that we should recall the former days, remember the former times. We're told to teach your children what happened in previous generations. All that's history. We know that in the Bible, anytime Israel forgot its history, it became something totally different than what it was supposed to be. When it remembered its history, it came back. For example, when Israel moved away from God under King Josiah, Josiah was trying to get Israel back to God, and the way they got back to God was they found an old scroll in the temple. It was their history. They read that and said, my gosh, I didn't remember we used to be like this. It led to a national revival. It's interesting how many national revivals are based on going back and finding history again. So with all the stuff on history, that is a big battlefield today. This is a great quote by George Orwell. He said, who controls the past controls the future. Who controls the present controls the past. Now take half of that at a time. Who controls the present controls the past. That's what schools and educational institutions are doing right now. Those who teach history today are controlling the past. They're choosing what they want you to know or what they don't want you to know or what they want to make up or what they want to omit or whatever it is. And so they're controlling the past, and whoever controls the past controls the future. So what's being taught in history right now in our classrooms is what America is going to be in the next generation. It will affect it. There's just no way around it. That's every nation. Every nation. We predicted when the Soviet Union was going to fall back in the 80s because we saw them start changing their textbooks, started taking Lenin out of their textbooks, started taking their heroes out. Now, those heroes needed to be gone, but that's what told us the wall was going to come down was we saw history textbooks change in Russia or Soviet Union. So history is a super important area. Boy, I'm still fast from moving on the plane. Sorry about that. I'll slow down and get here. So that's a great quote, and we see this really come into America. History came into play as a political tool really back about 1980. There was a guy named Howard Zinn. Howard Zinn was a history professor. He did this book, The People's History of the United States, and he took a very different approach to presenting history. Now, the Bible is a history book for sure. Now, and by the way, let me just say before I get into it, we own about 160,000 original items from American history, 120,000 items from before 1812, have thousands of handwritten documents of founding fathers and documents from black history and judicial history and anything you can think of. So we've got lots and lots and lots of originals. And so with history, we look at it very rigorously. We use that in Supreme Court. We use that legislatively. We have a network of 1,000 state legislators, Wall Builders Pro-Family Legislative Network. We'll monitor up to 110,000 pieces of state legislation a year. So I can pretty much tell you what's going on about anything. We're very involved at the federal level, just dozens and dozens of congressmen and U.S. senators, very involved at all different levels. We'll talk more about that later. But having said that, what happened is when you look at history, the Bible is definitely a history book. There's a lot of history there. And when you look at the way the Bible teaches history, take someone like David. We learn about the history of David in the Bible. And David, as a young man, killed a lion, he killed a bear, he killed Goliath. David grows up to be a great warrior, a great king. He frees this nation. He gets them out from under the Philistines and the Amorites and all the other enemies that they have. They become a great world power under David. David so loves God that he turns into a great worshiper. And as a result, most of the book of Psalms was written by David. So there's this great worshiper, and we still worship with those Psalms today. And David just did so many remarkable things, so much so that God made a covenant with David so that his heirs would sit on the throne for generations. So God and David really, really tight. However, David's not perfect because David, we're told in the Bible, never told his son Adonijah no on anything. Adonijah became a real problem. His other son, Absalom, rose up and tried to kill David. That's a real problem. And Absalom did kill his brother, David's son, Amnon, because David's son, Amnon, raped David's daughter, Terah. That's a messed up family. Now, on top of that, David commits adultery with Bathsheba and then goes and murders her husband, Uriah. That's really goofed up, too. So what you have with David is a story of the good and the bad and the ugly. And the Bible presents all of it. We learn all of it. Now, what happens with Howard Zinn is he comes in and finds everything bad or ugly about the United States he can find and says nothing good, all bad or ugly. This is what America is. It's like reading the story of David and only reading Bathsheba and Uriah. If you read that, you would never want to read a psalm in the Bible. This dude wrote those psalms. There's no way I'm going to read those psalms because he's a really bad guy. See, if you only know the bad, then you'll reject even the stuff that's good because you don't know it's there. And that's what he started doing. So he came up with this thing of attacking America for and he even made up a bunch of stuff that America didn't do, but it fit with the bad and ugly narrative, and it's called deconstruction. It's tearing things down by presenting a bad view of history. So many academics we run into today, that's their view. We have debates all the time with university professors and college campuses, et cetera, and they have this deconstruction view. Professors regularly tell us that America did more evil than it's ever done good in its history. It's got much more evil. It outweighs anything good that's done. So this now has showed up in a lot of different ways. A good way of pointing to this is when you go to the College Board. College Board is what produces the SAT test. That's one of the college entrance exams, SAT, ACT. With the SAT, or the College Board, they also do the 47 test for AP, or for AP classes. Now, AP is advanced placement classes. Those advanced placement classes, those are really sharp kids in high school that are getting college credit while they're in high school for taking that course. So an AP course is a high school course where you're so good you're getting college credit. One of the AP courses that they take and one of the AP courses they present is AP U.S. History, Advanced Placement U.S. History. It's done by the College Board. Now, to do the course, you need to know all the standards because the test is based on the standard, and they have 162 pages of standards. It's very interesting to read the history standards for AP U.S. History because it does not have any founding fathers. It doesn't have the American Revolution. It doesn't have the Civil War. There's no Abraham Lincoln. It has nothing of the major wars. For example, you get to World War II. There's no mention of Pearl Harbor. There's no mention of Japan. There's no mention of Hitler. There's no mention of the Nazis. There's no mention of the Holocaust. World War II is gone. There's no D-Day. There's no Midway. There's no Eisenhower. There's no Patton. There's no MacArthur. It's all gone except one area. They said America dropped an atomic bomb on Japan, raising questions about American values. Now, we didn't raise questions about Hitler's values because he wasn't there. And we didn't raise questions about Japan's values because they weren't there. The only nation we talk about in World War II is America, and the only thing we say about America is we dropped an atomic bomb. We're the bad guys in World War II. So this is the way we're teaching. And by the way, this history course is being taught in every county in the United States, every state, because this is AP history. This is not controlled by the state standards and state boards. So this has come from the outside, and this is where today we see a lot of change in our standards. Now, this deconstruction thing of tearing America down, we're seeing it go further into legislation now. This year, a number of states passed their history standards. Now, I've been appointed a number of states by state boards of education or governors or whatever to do history and social studies standards. And so this year, as a lot of states were passing their standards, and those standards can be once every 10 years or 12 years or 14, depending on the state. For example, for Minnesota, they pass new history standards every 10 years. States this year, a number of states passed their standards and said, well, we think that from here going forward, there are certain things we're not going to teach about anymore. And the things they decided to remove included the American Revolution, included the Civil War, included World War I and World War II and the Holocaust. All that's gone, so this is not going to be taught. Then what are you teaching? Well, we're teaching 1619 Project and critical race theory. We want people to know that America has been fundamentally flawed from the beginning, and she's been a really bad nation. And so this is what's now in the standards. I actually testified to the legislature in Louisiana because Louisiana's a conservative state. It's a red state. They said, we're not doing this. We're definitely not going that direction. So they introduced a bill that said, we're going to teach Civil War. We're going to teach the Holocaust, all these things. And it got to the floor of the Louisiana legislature, and they said, no, we're not going to teach the Civil War, and we're definitely not going to teach the Holocaust. They started taking all the stuff out. So the bill sponsor actually pulled the bill down rather than have it get passed with all that stuff taken out. So even in a very red state, you're seeing education do crazy things. So when you see this kind of stuff, the fact that we don't know our history anymore, the fact that it's really been taken out and rewritten, and by the way, the very things we're hearing today, we heard 30 years ago, 40 years ago, 50 years ago, 60 years ago. The reason that we didn't react, and thank you so much, appreciate that. The reason we did not, these things did not take hold 30 years ago because we knew too much of our own history. It just wouldn't work. But today we know so little of our own history that stuff that would never have worked even 15 years ago is now working today because we don't know who we are as a people. So what's happening when you see things like this is where you've seen now a sudden, inexplicable rise of things like Marxism and socialism and communism. You're going, how did this take foot? And by the way, this is along with critical race theory, and there's so many groups that have been promoting this across the United States, and they've been very active and very out front, and the media's cover them really well, and they're all into riot, rebellion, and radicalization. So this is what they're doing. So when you look at the critical race theory that's happening, what's being taught right now, that's a term that's being thrown around a whole lot, and most people don't have a good definition of it. So let me give you a definition of critical race theory. Critical race theory takes as a starting point that America was founded to protect and preserve slavery. Now, time out. Just notice the statement there. America was founded to protect and preserve slavery. What they're talking about is Jamestown. This is what the 1619 Project introduces. The 1619 Project is talking about the first American colony, Jamestown, in 1607, and it says that in 1619 the first slaves arrived in Jamestown, and America was founded to protect and preserve slavery. There's several problems historically with that. Number one, the Spanish brought slaves into North America in 1526 in the Carolinas. Number two, the Spanish brought slaves into Florida in 1655. And we've had slaves in the United States a long time before 1619, but let's talk 1619. What happened in 1619 was a Portuguese slave ship was sailing by the coast of Virginia. As it sailed by, two English privateers, and if you want to say that's pirates, those are private pirates, two English privateers went out and attacked that Portuguese ship and overcame it. So they took all the loot and all the booty and everything. Well, they had slaves on board, about 39, 40 slaves, and so the English captain split all the booty between them, and that meant one got 19 slaves and one got 20 slaves, and they said, what are we going to do with slaves? That interferes with our ability to attack other ships. We need to get rid of the slaves. So they went to the closest colony, which was Jamestown, and they said, hey, we got some slaves. You guys want any slaves? The people of Jamestown said, slavery is illegal in Jamestown. We can't take slaves. And they said, well, we don't want them. So they just dropped them on the shore and took off. So you've got 19 slaves there. And that's the landing of slaves that 1619 Project is talking about. 19 slaves landing there. One of the guys was a guy named Anthony Johnson. But what happened to slaves is the same thing that happened to everybody else that came to Virginia, and that is you came as an indentured servant. And what that means is you make yourself collateral. The state's going to pay for your food and your lodging and teach you some trade and whatever. And to make sure the state gets paid back for that, you're going to work for 5, 6, 7 years, whatever it is. At the end, the state gives you land, and you're completely free. It's like me, if I were to say, I want to go to the moon with SpaceX. That'd be really cool to go to the moon. And I call SpaceX and say, can I go to the moon? Sure. How much it cost? $2 million. I said, ooh, I don't have $2 million. But I'm probably worth about $150,000 a year. And so I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll work for you for 12 years if you'll take me to the moon. If you'll let me go to the moon, I'll work for your company for 12 years. That's an indentured servant. You're actually using yourself as collateral to pay off what's invested in you. SpaceX says, okay, you work for us for 12 years, we'll take you to the moon. So that's what an indentured servant was. And white and black, Virginia, all the same. Everybody, same policy. So what happened to these indentured servants, they all became free. They all owned land. It was given them by the state. Anthony Johnson was one of those who became free. He became wealthy. He became very prosperous. As a result, he started sponsoring indentures to America and Europe. Say, how much does it cost to go to America? I'm out of Europe. I'm tired of this. $10,000. I've got $700. Well, if you'll come work for me for 7 years, I'll get you over here, and then you get to be free, and you get your own land. So what happens, and they're not slaves, they're indentured servants. They're like employees. So they come over, and for the 7 years they work, and this is what Anthony Johnson was doing. He's bringing people over, giving them sponsors, indentureship. They'd work for him. They became wealthy and prosperous. One of the guys who came over was a guy named John Kaser. John Kaser was a black man. John Kaser, apparently, according to Anthony Johnson, was a lazy bum. Didn't work very hard at all, didn't do much. And so at the end of 7 years, Anthony Johnson said, I don't have my money back out of you. I'm losing ground on you. And so he went to court in 1653, and he asked the court of Virginia, he said, this guy, it'll take the rest of his life to pay off what I've invested in him. He is so lazy. Can I just own him for the rest of his life? And the court in Virginia said, yeah, you can own him for the rest of his life. That's the first slavery in America. It's not 1619, it's 1653, and it was when a black man sued to own another black man. Now, that didn't come out in the 1619 narrative. It's all there in the records of Virginia. And interestingly enough, that's the first slave ship that came to America. The second slave ship that came to America came to the Pilgrims in Massachusetts. When that slave ship arrived, the Pilgrims in Massachusetts promptly freed all their slaves and imprisoned all the slave owners, and they quoted the book of Exodus, where the book of Exodus says it is a capital offense to engage in man-stealing. Man-stealing is stealing someone from one nation and taking them to another and selling them into slavery. So in Massachusetts, they were always a free state. They didn't do this. That's why you'll find that in the northern states, you had blacks elected to office in 1641, like Matthias de Souza. You had black founding fathers like Wentworth Cheswell elected to New Hampshire in 1768. A black man elected by a white community, re-elected for the next 49 years, held 8 different political positions. One of the great figures in the history of New Hampshire was that black patriot. We don't even know him today. Or I can take you to Pennsylvania, 1793, black man Thomas Hercules elected to office by a white community because he's the best guy, the most competent. Across the north, it was a whole different story. So 1619 says, what we're going to do is we're going to tell you the story of David, but we're only going to tell you about Bathsheba and Uriah. And so 1619 is slavery in Virginia. And it wasn't even accurate on that. But nonetheless, slavery did happen in the South. There was slavery other places. Well, that's part of the story. No question that's part of the story. But the other part of the story is all the freedom and all the equality. There never was a time in Massachusetts history when blacks could not vote. At the time of the American War for Independence, 11 of the 13 states allowed blacks to vote. This stuff we just don't hear. We don't get that. But when we used to know our history, we would never have put up with 1619 project claims or critical race theory claims or et cetera. And by the way, America has had trouble with racism and has had trouble with slavery. You know why? Because America has people. Anytime people are involved, you're going to have a lot of goof-ups made. Every nation in the history of the world has not only had slavery, but they have at times been enslaved. There's no nation that's not been enslaved or had slaves. That's just the history of the world. So it's not an American problem. It's an international problem. It's a human problem. So going back to this, critical race theory takes as a starting point that America was founded to protect and preserve slavery, and that the American constitutional system is the source of society's ills, and that the foremost among all of our societal ills is that of racism. Now notice the sequence. Racism is the biggest problem America has, and racism is the product of our constitutional system. So if you want to get rid of racism, you're going to have to get rid of that constitutional system. This is the premise that goes with critical race theory, is you got to fundamentally throw out the system because it's completely flawed. That's what gives us our biggest problem. The only way we get rid of that problem is to get rid of what gave it to us, and that's the Constitution. Now, a lot of folks buy into this. You may have seen 2 weeks ago on Monday, the National Archives, where the Constitution, Declaration of Independence are housed, came out with warning labels for these two documents. They called it a harmful language alert. You shouldn't be reading the Constitution or the Declaration. This is harmful language. No, wait a minute. I've read those a bunch of times. Are we talking about the Declaration's harmful language that says all men are created equal? Because that's the best you're going to get in there, because there's nothing else. Or maybe in the Constitution, we're talking about the harmful language like the 13th Amendment that abolished slavery, the 14th Amendment that guaranteed equal rights, the 15th Amendment that guaranteed voting rights. Is that the part that's harmful language? Because if you read the Constitution, you don't see harmful language there. See, what they do is say, don't read the documents at all. These things are terrible. Well, if you don't read the documents, you don't know what's in them. So somebody tells you what's in them because you don't know it yourself, and it's a terrible document, so I'm not going to read it. So this is what's going on. As a result, very few Americans today, particularly, well, just so few Americans have a real appreciation or understanding of how unique and how different we are. We are one of 193 nations in the world today. Now, we had our revolution in 1776. We have our Constitution since 1789, and we've only had one Constitution ever, one revolution ever. It's all we've ever had. So in the same period of time that we've had our one government, and that's 1789, I want you to look at the other nations of the world and look at how many constitutions and how many governments they've gone through in the same period of time. Now imagine being in nations like, Ecuador or Haiti or France or whoever. And these, it doesn't matter whether they're enemies or friends. I mean, this is just a story of history. And so when you look at this and you look at all the instability and turmoil, a good question to ask is, all right, how long is the average constitution last? In the history of the world, what's the average length of a constitution? In the 5,800-year history of the world, the average length of a constitution is 17 years. That's how long constitutions last on average. Now, last September the 17th on Constitution Day, we hit our 234th birthday of the Constitution. We are so stable, that we don't appreciate how different we are. We think, well, every nation's the same. We can change our government to anything else and we'll be just the same. That's not true. As a matter of fact, every nation averages a violent revolution every generation and a new constitution every 17 years. I kind of like the fact that we've had one violent revolution and that we've had one constitution. I like the stability we have. In the same way, you look at creativity. America represents 4% of the world's population. Now, 4% of the world's population should produce 4% of the world's whatever. So when you look at our population, we have produced more technology, more cures, more discoveries, more medical findings, more space findings, more everything than the other 96% of the world combined. And we don't understand that we are so different from other nations. Now, I've got 2 kids active duty military right now. I do a whole lot of stuff for the military. I speak at lots of military bases, all the branches. I do a lot of trainings for military folks. And so I was asked to go to Germany to bases over there and do some trainings over there. I think Germany's got 26 or 27 bases. So I was over in Germany doing trainings, and they really treated me nice. I mean, I was over in Germany, and I'm a cowboy from Texas. I've got a really simple life and ranch and all the stuff that goes with it. And they put me up in a 5-star German hotel. Now, I'll point out, that's the old world elegance. I mean, that's where stuff is really, the castles. It's just really cool over there. And it was so cool because I'd walk in the hotel, and they all would call me by name. Mr. Barton, welcome back. Can we get you anything? And it was just like, wow, I've never been treated like this. And so that stay at that 5-star hotel was really neat. And it would have been even better if they would have had internet at that 5-star hotel. Now, I'll point out, even Motel 6, every one of them has internet. I mean, we just don't understand we just take for granted what we have when we think it's natural and it's normal, and it's not. Our 4% of the world's population actually produces 25% of the world's gross domestic product. The census is done every 10 years by requirement of the Constitution. We did it last year. It was turned in, I think, April of this year is, I think, when we got the final figures back. Whatever it was, according to census data from this current census, if you live in poverty in America, your lifestyle is higher than the middle class in Europe, poverty in America. Now, the World Bank is what sets the standard for global poverty. The World Bank says if you make $2 a day, that is living in poverty. That's $730 a year. Yet, if you go to Hawaii, or you go to Mississippi or several other states, they tell you, unless you're making more than $58,000 a year, you should not come off welfare, because that's what you get on welfare. Wait a minute. Poverty is $730 for the rest of the world, and we're talking about $58,000 over here. See, we don't understand how different we are. And so we're being told how terrible we are and how we need to throw it all away and get something different. What we enjoy now is called American Exceptionalism. That was a term that was given us back in 1831 by Lexington Tocqueville, Frenchman who came to America, wrote a book, Democracy in America. He said, the condition of the Americans is quite exceptional. I don't think any democratic people will ever be placed in the same position. Now, saying that we're exceptional, that's not braggadocious, cocky arrogance. We're simply saying America is the exception, not the rule. What we have is very different from other nations. It's not something we brag about how great we are. It's something we recognize and appreciate because we are different from other nations. Now, the question to ask is, Art, how do we get different from other nations? And we would invariably say, well, it's our political leaders. I mean, when you see a country do well, who's the leaders? And so who are the leaders responsible for what we have in America today? Well, we would start out and say probably George Washington and John Hancock and John Adams and guys like that. I mean, they had a lot of impact. No question that they did. But here's what's really interesting. In 1816, a young man named Hezekiah Niles contacted John Adams. Now, Hezekiah Niles was a young man. He had not gone through the American Revolution. He was born after it. He was kind of millennial of that generation. And here's old man Adams. And this letter's in 1816. That's 40 years after the Declaration of Independence. So Adams is an old man. And Hezekiah Niles says, I'm writing a book on the history of the American Revolution. I obviously was not there, but we really enjoy what we have in America today. You were there. You were an eyewitness. I want you to tell me, if you would, who do you think is responsible for all the things we enjoy today? And when John Adams was asked that question, he said, well, if you're asking me who's responsible for what America's become and the ideas and things, he said, right up top, I'd put the Reverend Dr. Samuel Cooper. And, of course, there's the Reverend Dr. Jonathan Mayhew. And don't forget the Reverend George Whitefield. And, of course, there's the Reverend Charles Johnson. He listed preachers. Now, we might today know who Whitefield is, but the chances that we know anything about Cooper, Mayhew, or Johnson is slim to none. We don't study preachers in history, even though they were political leaders, even though they gave us so much, and I'll show you how they did it in a minute. But we don't study preachers whether they're white or black. I mean, who in the world is Richard Allen or Absalom Jones or John Morant or Lemuel Haynes or Harry Hoosier? I mean, these aren't names we know. But let me just take Harry Hoosier for a minute. Harry Hoosier is a guy that was in the Great Awakenings. Now, the Great Awakenings back there had a lot of famous names: George Whitefield, John and Charles Wesley, people like Francis Asbury. Francis Asbury, we're told that Francis Asbury led 250,000 people to Christ. I mean, that's pretty amazing. And he conducted outdoor revival meetings that would just span acres. Massive crowds would show up. And Francis Asbury said, yeah, but Harry draws bigger crowds than I do. Really? That's got to be pretty big to get bigger crowds than Asbury got. And then you've got Benjamin Rush, who's a signer of the Declaration. He ratified the Constitution. John Adams said that our three most notable founding fathers, number one is George Washington, number two was Ben Franklin, number three was Benjamin Rush. And we've never even heard of Benjamin Rush today. Don't have a clue who he is. And yet he was one of the top three in the estimation of John Adams. Benjamin Rush says, I've heard Harry preach, and Harry's the best orator I've ever heard. Wait a minute. You're running around with guys like Patrick Henry and you're telling me that Harry's a better orator than Patrick Henry and all the others? He says, yeah, he's the best orator I've ever heard. Now, interestingly, Harry Hoosier had a ministry among what we might call frontier guys. It was blue collar. These were the guys that loved to be mountain men and pioneers and explorers and trappers and all the things that go with it. And so they really had a rugged and a tough, just a rugged personality, rugged life, language, everything else. And yet when they got converted, that seemed to change. Language changed, behavior changed, manners changed, everything was different. Now, Harry preached primarily along the East Coast. He preached in Pennsylvania and Philadelphia and up in Delaware and down in Jersey. But interestingly, as the nation grew west, as the nation started moving west across time, these pioneers and these trappers and these mountain men went with it because that's what they do. They love exploring. And so by the time you get to 1806 or 1807, they're over much further west than we've ever been before. And a lot of trappers are over there, and a lot of trappers would look at these guys that have been converted, and they say, they're really different from the rest of us. What's the deal with them? And the answer was, they're a bunch of those Hoosiers. Now, I'll point out, this is the Indiana Territory. Perhaps you've heard of the Indiana Hoosiers. I wonder how many people who live in Indiana know they were named after a black evangelist. Probably very few. Now, I don't know of any other person in history who has a state named after them with a nickname named after them, and yet we never cover this guy in American history books. I've only met 3 people from Indiana who knew where their name came from. They don't even cover it in the state of India. See, we just have lost so much of the history we knew, and so many heroes like this that we don't talk about anymore. So going back to John Adams says, well, it's all these preachers responsible. How in the world did you get that? Well, he talked about the fact that, and by the way, John Adams, I'm going to show you some more things he said about this later, but historians have documented that every single right set forth in our birth certificate, in the Declaration of Independence, every single right set forth in the Declaration had been preached from the American pulpit prior to 1763. What that means is the Declaration of Independence is a listing of sermon topics that we were hearing for 15 years before we wrote the Declaration. Now, in those hundreds, thousand documents that we own from before 1812, I have thousands of early sermons. A lot of handwritten sermons, a lot of published sermons from these guys. It's amazing to see what they covered. As a matter of fact, John Adams talked about the fact that our pulpits have thundered. And you look at those old sermons, and he's right, because we really address biblical relevancy in a way that most Christians couldn't do today. And I'm not saying churches, I'm just saying Christians. Most Christians don't even know what the Bible says about many issues. For example, this is a sermon preached in 1755. It's preached by Reverend Dr. Jonathan Mayhew, one of the guys that John Adams said, this is the dude. Right there is a sermon on earthquakes. Now, Boston was not used to having earthquakes back then. So when it did have an earthquake, the belief was whatever's in the headlines, whatever's in the news, we need to show how the Bible applies to everything going on around us. So since we just had an earthquake in Boston, let's talk about that. Now, I've got to say that I believe it is a responsibility of Christians to read the Bible from cover to cover every year. We should be doing that. Jesus tells us a man doesn't live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds out of the mouth of God. And yet right now, only 9% of Christians read the Bible on a daily basis. Now, what would happen to your body if you only ate a meal once a day or once a week or once a month, like some people do the Bible? I mean, you'd be dead physically. Well, that's what happens spiritually, because you got to feed the spirit just like you have to feed the body, and so the Word of God is what does that. So we should be reading the Bible on a regular basis. So I've got a lot of white hair, so I've read the Bible a lot of times, and I started thinking, okay, if I had to do a teaching on earthquakes in the Bible, what could I do? Well, I do remember that the prophet Amos talked about an earthquake in his generation, And King Uzziah, there was an earthquake in Chronicles when he was king, and there was an earthquake when Jesus was killed. When he died, there was an earthquake when Jesus was resurrected. And I thought, I bet you I could do a good 15, 20-minute sermon on earthquakes. Well, good for me. This is a 5-week sermon on earthquakes. I'm nowhere close. And so I got really curious. And so I just went online and did an online search for earthquakes. I was shocked at how many earthquakes occurred in the Bible. And I've read it so many times, I've just never looked for that kind of relevancy. They were looking for relevancy back then. They went into God's Word and found relevancy in everything. And by the way, before we go much further, let me point out the story of Israel just real quickly. Israel for 400 years were slaves in Egypt. When they were delivered out of Egypt through the Red Sea and the 10 miracles, what you had was a group of people who thought like slaves, acted like slaves, behavior was like. 400 years they've been slaves. They don't know what freedom's like. They don't know anything about it. And all they know is the Egyptian way of life with a Pharaoh. So God delivers them, and they don't have an enemy anymore. Nobody's chasing them because they're wiped out in the Red Sea, and God leads them by a pillar of cloud and pillar of fire, gets them out to the mount there, Mount Sinai, and he stops them there. He says, now, you guys don't have a clue where you're going, and there's nobody chasing you, so I have your full attention. So let me tell you how it's going to be. And he delivered to them not just the 10 Commandments, which we often talk about on the Mount. He delivered them 613 laws. Those 613 laws took that group of slaves and made them the greatest nation in the ancient world. They went from being a bunch of slaves to being the greatest nation, and still historically considered one of the greatest nations of any civilization, because those 613 laws dealt with economics, they dealt with immigration, they dealt with criminal justice, they dealt with due process, they dealt with everything you can think of. It's not just spiritual things that they dealt with. And so that's why there's so much material for these sermons back then. So we had sermons on things like natural disasters. Here's a sermon on the Cry of Sodom inquired into. This is what we would call an LGBTQ sermon. And although the Word of God is very clear about this, polling shows us today that 77% of Christians will not talk about this issue for fear of being attacked. If I say something, I'm going to get deplatformed, or I'll get my brains beaten on social media, or I'll get a strike, or whatever. We just have gone silent because we know that this is an issue that sits the other side off, and we just rather keep our mouth shut than say anything. And yet, even back then, they were talking about this because the Bible talked about this. Here's a sermon on comets. And as it says at the bottom, 2 sermons occasioned by the late blazing star. Now, I can show you sermons also on the discovery of new planets. I can show you sermons on solar eclipses, sermons on lunar eclipses. And again, I didn't know that stuff was in the Bible. I read these sermons and was shocked at the verses. I read one sermon on solar eclipse, and it turned out to come out of the little bitty book of Amos. That's a small book, but it had a bunch of eclipses in it. And I looked online and found all sorts of eclipses in the Bible I didn't even remember. And I read the Bible regularly. So there was a lot that dealt with astronomy and science. This is a sermon on the infirmities and comforts of old age. Probably not a particularly popular topic, but it's one everybody's got to deal with. Everybody grows old, and everybody has to deal with people who are growing old. So we had sermons on aging. This is a sermon on religion and patriotism, the constituents of a good soldier. We had so many sermons on military issues. I mean, military was a big deal. And by the way, even when John the Baptist was baptizing, remember he had specific instructions for officers and for soldiers. There's a lot that the Bible's filled with on military. And then you got sermons like this. This is the relation of the medical profession to the ministry. Now, this is a sermon on health care. And I'll take you back to those 613 laws. There's a whole block of those laws that deal with health care. And at the time those laws were delivered, the Egyptians, the Assyrians, and the Babylonians all laughed at the Hebrews on how backward they were. Have you seen their health code? This is the dumbest stuff ever. And yet now, it's interesting, doctors like Dr. S.I. McMillan have gone through and taken all the health laws out of the Bible and shown with multiple medical studies that God was right 3,000 years before anybody recognized he was right. As it turns out, all the stuff he told them to do 3,000 years ago, we have now confirmed is the right medical procedure for lots of stuff. So it's a great book, None of These Diseases, name of the book by Dr. S.I. McMillan, but it points out the health care laws in the Bible. This is a sermon on the character and tendency of the property tax as adapted to a permanent system of taxation by the Reverend George Glover. What? Yeah, economics. Matter of fact, the Bible talks about things like the estate tax. It talks about the capital gains tax. It talks about the progressive income tax. It talks about the capitation tax. As a matter of fact, back up before that, America is the first nation in the world to come up with a free market, or first nation in the modern world, let's say after the birth of Christ. After the time of Christ, we're the first nation to come up with what we now call the free market economic system. It's one of the reasons we're so prosperous, so we have a different system. And I can take you through historically and show where that came from. A lot of professors today say, well, Adam Smith did that. The Wealth of Nations came out in 1776. He's the father of modern economics. Sorry, America had a free market system. Free market businesses running in 1627, like Apatuxet, Massachusetts, started by the Pilgrims, and that they started the first business there. And you find that 150 years before Adam Smith did his stuff, we were already doing all the same stuff in America, and it came from 5 Bible verses. 2 Thessalonians 3:10, 1 Timothy 5:8, it came from Matthew 20, Luke 19, and Matthew 25. I can show you historically in the writings of the governors where they've discovered a verse, implemented it economically, and it changed the nation. So we had sermons on economics. Here's a sermon on the higher law, the Fugitive Slave Bill. Now, this is an 1851 sermon about an 1850 federal law. In 1850, and let me back up, the federal government has passed millions of laws, millions. This has got to be the top worst law ever passed by the federal government. And that's why these sermons were so significant. I have a whole bundle of these sermons all over the country. Pastors took to the pulpit and said, people, here's the law Congress just passed. And let me tell you, if you obey that law by Congress, you will be disobeying all these laws by God. Because here's what God says, and here's what Congress said. You have to commit civil disobedience. If you don't, you're disobeying what God specifically said. Now, this is the law that led to the start of the Underground Railroad. This is the law that led to the strength and the crystallization of the abolition movement. I mean, it was so wicked. And it's interesting, across the country, as prosecutors would take and try to prosecute people under these laws, juries across the nation freed every one of those who'd been accused because the law was so wicked. There's no way they're going to convict somebody under a law like that. They're not guilty of breaking the law. They're guilty of obeying God's law. We're not going to punish them for that. So, I mean, this is the kind of stuff we had going. Social policy, we had stuff on elections, etc. So we covered everything. And this is the biblical relevancy that we had. And so, John Adams talked about our pulpits of thunder and this biblical relevancy. It's interesting today, we do a lot of polling work, a lot of political polling, cultural polling. We work with folks like George Barton and other pollsters. And so when you look at where we are today and say, okay, how about now? It's interesting that when you look at now, all these things that are popping up on the screen in front of you are all issues that have been in the news in the last 24 months. I chose them because they have been in the news. I also chose them because the Bible speaks about every one of them very specifically. Now, can Christians take the Bible and what it says and apply to these things? Probably not. Matter of fact, polling shows that only 1 out of 16 can apply biblical principles to what the Bible talks about in that area. So we really don't know the Bible well. And again, that's where I said only 9% of Christians read the Bible on a daily basis. That's the poll done by the American Bible Society. So we don't know this stuff very well. So it's not there. And then we do polling also in churches. What are churches doing? What are church leaders doing? And we found that out of 384,000 senior pastors and churches in America, only 2.8% are willing to talk about something from the pulpit if it's also mentioned in the public arena. So we've just gone silent on a lot of the stuff. The kind of sermons that John Adams talked about is just not there anymore. And this is why you see such a change in the American demography right now. If you look at Christians in America, back in the year 2000, 85% of Americans professed to be Christians. As of last year, it was down to 65%. So we've lost 20% in 20 years. So what's going on? Well, in polling the people who no longer go to church, we ask them, why don't you go to church anymore? And 2 out of 3 say, because the church lacks relevancy. I don't get anything that helped me live on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. Yes, I find Christ, I get salvation, but I don't have a clue what to do with the economy, and I don't have a clue what to do with this issue or education or whatever. So that's something where the church has got to get back to it. And you see stats like this, and this is why people are saying, we got to have a revival. We need to be praying for revival, and we do. And I don't think a revival is going to come the way any of us expect. And I say that historically and biblically. And I think we have a real problem getting a revival. And the problem is right now we have a national focus. Let me see if I can explain this. Everybody gets the news from somewhere. So if you're on the right, you probably listen to Fox News or the Blaze or Victory News or Newsmax or something. If you're on the left, you listen to CNN or MSNBC, whatever it is, you get national news. I'll bet you've not heard a single story about Scottsbluff, Nebraska, or Waterton, New York, or Yukon, Oklahoma, or Jacksboro, Texas. We get all the national news. And as a consequence of the national news, man, we know what's happening in Congress, and we know what's happening at the Supreme Court, and we know what's happening at the White House. We're all very cognizant of that. Now, we probably can't name 2 people that are on the city council. Might not name anybody on the junior college board. We don't have a clue who these. We know the national stuff real well. And let me explain to you why this is a problem. I'm very involved in all those arenas. I've been involved in 13 cases at the U.S. Supreme Court, involved in other cases here at the Supreme Court. Know the court well. And you know what? The court's a real pain, and I can't get those justices to do anything. They're not accountable to me or anybody else. They do what they want to do. Most of what we call the culture war came out of the courts, not the legislatures. So these guys, they're a real problem at times. I can't get them to do it, and I'm actively engaged there. And then you look at the White House. Man, I've actively been engaged at the White House because 8 weeks ago when we were getting out of Afghanistan, things were so goofed up. Now, let me back up. 6 years ago, Glenn Beck, a good friend of mine, Glenn, national personality, a radio personality, he started what was called the Nazarene Fund. We started that to save persecuted Christians all over the Middle East. And so Glenn and I have been running that for the last 6 years. And so we had all these persecuted Christians in Afghanistan. We had to get out of there. And while we're in the middle of getting those persecuted Christians out, now we find there's a ton of Americans that got left behind. And there's a whole bunch of allies that the Taliban's after. We saw the Taliban going door to door looking for interpreters and those that help the Americans, and they would hang them on the spot. They're going door to door looking for Christians, and if they found Christians, they beheaded them and then burned the bodies. I mean, it's just barbaric what was going on. And so we got to get these guys out of there. So at that point in time, 8 weeks ago, the military asked us if we would take over the civilian flight operations getting planes out of Afghanistan. We said, sure. So in the last 2 weeks of Kabul, we're getting folks out of there and then move up to Mazar Sharif and getting folks out of there. So in the last 8 weeks, we've gotten 6,000 people out of Afghanistan. Thousands and thousands of Christians. We've gotten hundreds of Americans out of Afghanistan. We got all these folks out of Afghanistan. And as bad as the Taliban is, that hadn't been our biggest problem. The biggest problem's been the State Department. The State Department's harder than anything else. We have planes in the air getting people out, and the State Department cancels the clearances, calls those planes back. We have planes going to Macedonia. They call to Macedonia and say, turn that plane back, don't accept it. We have planes going to Albania. We're getting people out, and the State Department's turning them back. What is the deal with this? So what we do is we start trying to get Secretary Blinken to put pressure on the State Department. Eventually we get pressure put on the State Department. The Secretary Blinken says, let those planes go. And the State Department says, no, we're not. We don't think they should go. I'm the Secretary of State. Let them go. No, we're not going to. It's interesting that if you're aware of the Civil Service Act back in the 60s that we put in place, you can't fire federal employees. You remember what happened with the Veterans Administration, all the thousands of veterans that died from bad medical treatment? As a result of that, only one guy got fired, and it took an act of Congress to do it. They had to pass a bill to fire one guy. So you've got guys in the State Department that hate America. They're communists, and they're socialists, and they're Marxists, and they don't want America to succeed, and you'd have no control over it. Even Secretary of State couldn't do it. So you can't get Secretary Blinken doing it, so we're fighting with the White House and fighting with the State Department executive agencies. So what we do is say, all right, I think we think we got a plan here. Let's go to Pakistan and ask for their help, because Taliban came out of Pakistan. So, but now, as it turns out, the new Prime Minister of Pakistan was educated in the West. He has a very different view of what Pakistan should be. It shouldn't be a terrorist nation. It should be among the community of nations and the diplomacy in the rest of the world. So what we do is I go to Congress and get a bunch of senators and a bunch of reps to write a letter to the Prime Minister of Pakistan and say, hey, would you intervene on a humanitarian effort and help us get these people out of there? And so the Prime Minister of Pakistan goes to the Taliban and says, let these guys out of here. Let the planes go. And so we start getting planes off the ground. I got more help from the Prime Minister of Pakistan than I got from the White House. It's crazy stuff. And then, 2 weeks ago, the Prime Minister of Albania, he got on a broadcast in Europe and said, look, as Christians, Christian nations in Europe, we need to be taking persecuted Christians in Afghanistan and bring them in. And so we said, yeah, exactly, because we've got thousands and thousands of people we've gotten out of Afghanistan, but they're stacked up in UAE and Abu Dhabi and Doha. No nation will take them. And so here we got the Prime Minister of Albania saying nations take them. And so got a bunch of congressmen and senators and reps to write him and encourage him to take more and speak out. So I'm working with all this stuff. And you know what? I don't get any help from these guys. It drives me crazy. And I can call all sorts of people. But I've got connections. And a lot of people don't have the connections I've got. This is why we all get super frustrated with what we see out of the federal government on the news. We get paralyzed. And this is our problem. We shouldn't be looking at the national stuff. We should be looking at the local stuff. And let me give you examples of how this works. Let me take you back to the American War for Independence. The first 4 battles in the American War for Independence, going from top right around. Top right is the Battle of Lexington. Top left is 3 hours later, the North Bridge of Concord. The bottom left is the battle on the road to Boston, 19-mile running battle. And bottom right is the Battle of Bunker Hill. So what happens is in all 4 of these battles, and this is the start of the American War for Independence, in none of those battles did any of these folks say, hey, George, we need your help. I mean, you're the national commander-in-chief. We got 700 British here. We need help quick. Nobody called for George to do anything. Every one of these guys said, it's our community. We'll take care of it. We'll solve the problems here. They all acted locally. It's very interesting. Now, this is not to say George wasn't important, because he was. We needed George at Battle of Brandywine and Battle of Monmouth and Battle of Yorktown, etc. But there's more than 80 battles in the American War for Independence, and nearly all of them were local battles that were won by local people from local cities. Let me just take you through real quick. Let's take the top right one there. The top right one. Guys, would you hit my computer up there? The notification thing. There you go. Thank you. So let's take this one top right. This is the Battle of Lexington. This happened on April the 17th, of April 19th, 1775. And so what happened was 700 British came to the little bitty village of Lexington. And at that point, 70 men from the village went out there and said, nope, you're not going to do this. Now, that's what we hear in textbooks. That's not accurate. 700 British came to town, and the church of the Reverend Jonas Clark, with its 70 men, went out there to take it on. It was the church that went out there. Pastor Clark had been teaching his guys. He said, guys, here's what the Bible says about war, because it looks like we're going to have one. The Bible makes it very clear you cannot engage in an offensive war. You can only engage in a defensive war. So you cannot fire the first shot. You have to wait till they fire at you, and then you have the right of self-defense. You can fire back. So when those 70 guys got assembled out there, the deacon of the church, John Parker, got them together and said, guys, remember what Pastor Clark's been teaching us. Here's the deal, and this is his famous line, don't fire unless fired upon. That's a defensive war. But if they mean to have a war, let it begin here. And so he just drew the line. We're not going to let the British do this in our community. So what happens was, and these are tough dudes, 700 British line up, and 70 Americans face them across the way. And by the way, I don't care how good you are. You can be a SEAL team member back then. Everybody's got a single-shot musket that takes 15 to 20 seconds to reload. So 700 guys are going to get the first shot at 70 guys standing there. And we don't get to shoot back till after they shoot. That's not a whole lot of fun, which is why 18 Americans hit the ground that morning. 18 Americans hit the ground. Among them were black patriots like Prince Estabrook and white patriots like John Robbins. Black and white went to church together. Yes, they did. That was the way it was outside of Jamestown and, that southern band. Up in that northern band, it's a whole different story. So what happens is the next battle happens 3 hours later, because the British weren't going to Lexington. They were going through Lexington, but Lexington said, you're not going to do this. We're stopping you here. Well, then they get to the North Bridge of Concord. When they get to the North Bridge of Concord, what happens there is there are 300 Americans who come out to meet them. At least that's what history books say today. That's not true either. It was the church of the Reverend William Emerson with his 300 parishioners who went out there to meet them. And they got out there and they said, you guys already fired at us. We get to shoot back now. So we shot back at them, and that's where the first British hit the ground, was at Concord. And the British are saying, wait a minute, this is not going well. We had 70 back here. We got 300 here. There's only 700 of us. We better get back quick and get reinforcements, or we're going to be outnumbered in a hurry. And that's what led to the battle on the road to Boston, a 19-mile running battle. And it was a problem for the British, because whereas they faced 70 and then 300, they faced 4,500 Americans on the road back to Boston. Where'd those guys come from? Well, Reverend Payson Phillips grabbed his church and brought them over there. Reverend Benjamin Balch grabbed his church and brought them. Again, it was churches standing up and saying, you're not going to do this in our community. Then you get to the Battle of Bunker Hill. And Battle of Bunker Hill, Reverend Joseph Willard said, come on, I got 2 companies in the church. Let's go across town and fight everybody, the British with everybody else. Churches kept showing up again. And by the way, if you can see that picture on the lower right side of the screen at the bottom, there are 2 guys standing there. There's a white guy named Thomas Grover, and the black guy right beside him is Peter Salem. Peter Salem is hands down the hero of that battle. When that battle was over, 13 white officers wrote commendations for him and said, this guy's got to be promoted. He saved the lives of every one of us. If it wasn't for him, we'd all be dead. And for generations, Peter Salem appeared in all of our textbooks as the hero. And by the way, you'd be shocked to know how many heroes of major battles of the Revolution were black patriots, not white patriots. How come we don't hear that? Because in 1902, a new series of textbooks came out from progressives, and they eliminated every black name in history. They even took Frederick Douglass out. That's why when you have Black History Month today, it's usually modern 20th century people. We celebrate MLK and Rosa Parks, and that's great. What happened to all the people we had back then? We don't know them anymore, because they've been gone since 1902 out of nearly all textbooks. So we don't know the stuff that happens here, but all to say is we won a national victory. We won the National War of Independence because of local battles. It was all this local stuff that allowed us to win the war. It wasn't George leading us to glory because he's a great national leader. We needed George. Don't misunderstand me. He was super important, but it was the local stuff that made all the difference. We needed national help occasionally, but it was local stuff. And you see, revivals are the same way. So we keep praying for a national revival. Revivals don't happen nationally. They happen locally. And we say, well, wait a minute. If they happen locally, I mean, if you're saying revivals occur locally, what do you do with things like the Great Awakening? Because that was a national revival. Interesting premise. Look at that just a minute. Because we think of people like George Whitefield. I mean, he's the great leader in the national revival, right? George Whitefield preached for 34 years in America, preached 18,000 sermons in America, 14,000 sermons in England, preached 32,000 sermons in 34 years. That's averaging 3 sermons a day, by the way. And 80% of all Americans physically heard him preach a sermon. Now, that's message penetration. I mean, that's like 270 million Americans today hearing whatever we say. And we say, well, that's easy. You can do a live stream. They didn't have any technology back then. So how did 80% of Americans physically heard him preach a sermon? Because he was in that many communities. He had revival after revival in all the local communities. You see, for 34 years, he started in Maine and went down to Georgia and back to Maine 7 times on horseback over 34 years, found a different route every time. He stopped in every single town he came to and preached along the way. Stopped in this town, preached to 500, a little revival breaks out. He went over here to Philadelphia, 12,000, revival breaks out. He went over here and preached in Westchester, 1,500, revival breaks out. Went over here to this town of 750, revival breaks out. It's a national revival because so many local communities had revivals. That's why it looked national. It's the same with the American War for Independence. We think it's a national victory. No, it's a bunch of local victories. And so significantly, as you look at what Whitefield did, we don't talk about people today like Samuel Cooper. Remember John Adams called him out? He's the guy who kept the revival going in Boston. He was the local pastor who kept it fired up in Boston. And you had Gilbert Tennant. Gilbert Tennant right there, he's the guy from Pennsylvania, Philadelphia. That's what kept the revival going there. He kept it going for years and years and years. And the same with Samuel Davies in the rural parts of Virginia. He kept the revival fired up. See, it was local churches that kept the revival fired up. It looks like a national revival, but it's not. It's a bunch of local revivals that came together to make a national revival. So the emphasis on all this is you got to get the local focus, not the national focus. Now, let me convert that to a little more practical stuff as I start winding this thing down. Let's convert it to something as simple as voting. And people get so tired of hearing about voting. This is the election that won't stop. I mean, it keeps going and going and going. And so we're tired of hearing about recounts. We're tired of hearing about dominion. We're tired of hearing about fraud. All right, forget all that. Let's just look at some things about voting from a philosophical standpoint. To vote in the United States takes 2 things. You have to be a legal citizen. You have to be 18 years or older. If you can do that, 100% of those who are legal citizens 18 years or older can vote. The only thing we ask you to do is please register. We just want to make sure 7 different people didn't vote in your name or whatever. Just register. Right now, nationally, only 65.3% of Americans are registered to vote. Now, that means 120 million have already checked out and said, I don't care what happens to America. I'm not going to do anything with it. So 120 million checked out. Now, you have 2 types of elections. You have a presidential election, and that's what we had last year. Over the last 11 presidential elections, the average voter turnout is 54% for the last 11 presidential elections. But that's 54% of 65%. It's not 54% of the whole. It's 54% of registered voters, which means 36% of adults vote in a presidential election. It takes half of that to win, which is 18% chooses the President of the United States. If you go to the off-year elections, which is like next year, we choose governors and we choose senators, we choose reps. The average for the last 21 election cycles, the average off-year voter turnout is 39%, or 38%. But that's 38% of 65%, which means 26% of adults choose our governors and our senators and our reps, which means half of that wins. That's 13%. So what we're saying is only 1 out of 5 Americans chooses the President of the United States, and only 1 out of 8 Americans chooses our governors and our senators and our reps. That's not very high. Let's go to local level. At the local level, you usually average around 6% in most cities on turnout, but that's 6% of 65%, which means only 4% of adults are voting, and it takes half of that to win, which is 2%. Let me give you some examples. Let's take Eric Garcetti. You may know Los Angeles. Garcetti's the mayor there. Los Angeles is a super big city. The population of Los Angeles is larger than the individual population of 23 separate states. So Garcetti is like being mayor, it's like being governor in 23 states. Garcetti brags about the fact that if he's elected mayor of Los Angeles with 2.9%, he says. Now, let me take you to Houston real quick, my state of Texas. In Houston, that's another really big city. It's larger than 20 individual states. So if you're mayor of Houston, it's like governor of 20 states. elected Denise Parker mayor of Houston. She's the first open lesbian mayor of Houston. And when she was elected, she said, I am so tired of people saying that marriage between a man and a woman, that's a personal attack on me. No, Anise, it's not. We were saying that before you were ever born. We've been saying that for 5,800 years since God created Adam and Eve. So what happened was she said, I don't want to hear it anymore. So she introduced, and by the way, she was chosen with 4.9% of the vote. You want me to change, Matt? Thanks, bro. So what happens is she's elected 4.9% of the vote, but that was 4.9%, 65%. She's actually elected with 3.3% of the vote of the city. So she gets in office, says, I don't want to hear anything else about marriage as a man and woman, and she passed what was called a HERO. Now, HERO stands for Houston Equal Rights Ordinance. So Houston Equal Rights Ordinance, 200 major cities in the U.S. have passed equal rights ordinances or equal rights amendments. They have various denominators, but that's what they're called. And in it, she says, anyone who says marriage is a man and woman, that's a hate crime. So once that got passed and the city council put it through, she then went after a bunch of pastors. She subpoenaed 16 different forms of communication with these pastors. I want to see all your notes. I want to see all your sermons. I want to see your phone call logs. I want to see your emails. I want to see your texts. I want to see all your social media. And if you've said marriage between a man and woman, I'm going to prosecute you. Well, the city of Houston said, no, wait a minute. That's not what we elected you for. We thought we were going to do economic stuff and grow the city. And so what happened was we got 4,500 churches together and did a referendum. Got it on the ballot, said, let's vote about this. The day before the referendum, I forget it's the Houston Chronicle, Houston Post, one of the others. The day before the referendum, they did the polling and said, it's a hands down. She's going to win this, a 60-40 margin. The numbers were really clear. Well, election night, it actually turned out that it wasn't that way because instead of 3% turning out, 14% of the city turned out, and we won the election with a 22-point margin. We crushed them. We crushed them 61 to 39. Same thing in San Antonio. San Antonio made it a Class C misdemeanor to say that marriage between a man and a woman. That was a $500 a day fine. If you said marriage between a man and a woman, then you were prohibited from ever holding office in San Antonio, and you're not allowed to do any business with the city. You couldn't be a paving contractor. You couldn't do landscaping. And so 2,100 churches got together there and said, that's the end of that. And so what happens is when you up the turnout, you have a very different result, and especially when people of faith get involved and up that turnout. So let me give a couple more examples. I want to take you to Fort Worth, Texas. Fort Worth, Texas, 6 years ago, it was in the Fort Worth Independent School District where they said, hey, we think that what we want to do is, starting right now with the schools here in Fort Worth, we're not going to have genders anymore. So you can choose any bathroom you want. You can choose any locker room you want. You can choose any shower room you want. We don't care. You just choose what you want. And so parents said, huh? What? And this is Fort Worth, Texas. Now, when this happened 6 years ago, Arnie Duncan, who was the President Obama's Secretary of Education, said this is a great idea. And he picked it up and he said, here's the new standard. Out of the U.S. Department of Education, any school, no school that receives federal funds can have genders, bathrooms, locker rooms, shower rooms. So if you get federal funds, you can't do this. Now, I'll tell you, this was a real problem for me because if you don't know the nickname of Fort Worth, it's called Cowtown, USA. That is its nickname. Being a cowboy, nobody on any ranch has any difficulty determining gender. I mean, it's a really easy thing. You can walk behind those cow critters right there and you can tell which are bulls and which are steers and which are cows. And I've never seen a bull become a cow and I've never seen a cow become a bull. I mean, Cowtown, USA? Really? You're the one that started this thing? So I looked at the city of Fort Worth because I live right outside the city of Fort Worth. There's 800,000 voters in Fort Worth. And the president of the school board who introduced this silly policy that got passed, that became national policy, was elected with less than 1,200 votes, 1,182 votes. So I looked in his district where he lived and ran. And in his district, I quickly found an evangelical church that had more than 3,000 Bible-believing adults in the church. That one church could have kept him from being in office, which has saved the entire nation, the nonsense that came out of one city and went across the nation. Two more examples. and go to what happened in Bentonville. Bentonville is northwest Arkansas. This is the hometown of Walmart. There are 40,000 people who live in that town. And a lady in Bentonville said, you ain't doing this in my town. And so a Christian lady, she ran for school board, and she got elected in Bentonville, town of 40,000 people. There were 35 votes cast in that election. She won the election with a total of 35 votes cast. But that's not as good as Riceville, Iowa. Riceville, Iowa, up on the northern border of Iowa, a farmer up there, as I recall, he's a pig farmer. This farmer up there said, you sure ain't doing this in our town. And so he ran for school board in the town. And turned out on election day, he got busy on the farm, didn't go vote. And don't jump to the conclusion that he lost by one vote, because that's not it. What happened was nobody voted in that election at all. Had he voted for himself, he would be on the school board now if he just voted for himself. See, this is local stuff, and we keep looking at national stuff, trying to fix Congress and fix the courts and fix the president. Oh my gosh, look around us and see, look at stuff like this and see that this is the local focus we've got to get into. We've got to see this is where revival comes, this is where change comes at the local level. And it's interesting that means if you're going to elect people to office, you got to somehow get involved in government. Well, it's interesting. Benjamin Rush, I mentioned him earlier, one of the three most notable founding fathers. By the way, all the other stuff he did, he's one of the greatest educators in American history. He started 5 universities. He's the first one to train black physicians, first one to give academic education to women. He also started the first abolition society in America, ran it. He also started the Sunday school movement. He also started the first Bible society in America, just an amazing guy. So he's called the father of public schools under the Constitution. And in 1790, after he'd ratified the Constitution, he came out with a piece as an educator on the mode of education proper in public. He said, we used to be 13 nations. Now we're one nation with 13 states. So what should our schools be teaching if we're going to be a strong nation? He said, our public schools must teach 3 things. He said, the first thing our public schools must do is teach students to love and serve God. He said, the second thing public schools must do is teach students to love and serve their country. And the third thing is public schools have to teach students to love and serve their family. Now, please notice the sequence. God, country, family. We'd say, no, Ben, think you got that wrong. Should have been God, family, country, because family is more important than country. Should be family higher. He said, no, it's God, country, family. Why did he put it in that sequence? Because he pointed out that if you ever lose control of your country, it will become the great enemy of your family. If you want to protect your family, you get involved with the country, make sure it doesn't get twisted off and get into goofy policies, and that way you do protect your family. So if you're going to do that, that means you need good people to vote for when you go to elections. You need to know who they are. And how do you get good people? Well, that's where the Bible gives us a lot of guidance. And by the way, it's because we're not involved in even local schools. Local schools have become the cesspools of so much of what's coming out in so many areas. Attacking American values. I hate American stuff. I hate your morality. I hate your whatever it is. And this is why you're seeing school boards. I've run elections for a long time. I've run elections from dog catcher up to the President of the United States. And I'm involved in a state right now where that as of today, we're finishing the voting guides on 180 school board races. Now, I've never had 180 school board races in 30 years of doing it. I haven't had 10 school board races. And now this year, everybody is starting to notice what's going on at the local level and starting to say, we got to have different people. And so what you see in Loudoun County, that's national. People are thinking school board. I mean, I find this all over the country, what's happening. So if you want good candidates to run for school board, there's a Bible verse that gives good guidance on this. It's called the parable of the trees of the field. It's in Judges 9, and it said the trees got together and they wanted civil government. So it says that the trees went out to anoint a king over them, and they went to the good trees. They went to the olive tree, and they said, Mr. Olive Tree, come reign over us. And the olive tree said, no, I ain't going to do that. Said, should I leave my fatness wherewith by me they honor both God and man to go be promoted over the trees? I'm not going to get involved in that stuff. And they said, okay, if we can't get the olive tree, let's go get the fig tree. So they went to the fig tree, another good tree, and said, come down and reign over us. Be a civil leader. And the fig tree said, no way am I going to do that. Should I leave my sweetness and my good fruit and go be promoted over the trees? And they said, well, if we can't get the olive tree or the fig tree, let's go get the vine, because that's another good one. They went to the vine and said, Mr. Vine, come and reign over us. And vine said, ain't going to do it. The vine said, should I leave my wine, which cheers both God and men, go be promoted over the trees? So notice what happened here. They went to all these good trees, and all the good trees had reasons for why they couldn't get involved, reasons for why they couldn't do it. Got too much soccer games, got too many things with the kids doing. So what happens next? Well, it says that the parable of the trees of the field, the next thing that happened was the tree said, well, if we can't get the good guys, let's go ask the bramble. Now, this is not going the right direction. So let's go ask the bramble. And would you know, when they asked the bramble to be the ruler, the bramble said, I'm happy to do that. It says, if you anoint me king over you, then come and put your trust in my shadow. I'll just ask you, how much fun is it to sit in the shade of a thorn bush? Probably not a heck of a lot of shade. And my argument is that we have way too many thorn bushes ruling today. I mean, it's just unbelievable. We did a poll last year. It's the first poll done in modern America ever on the beliefs of elected officials and legislators. And so we checked legislators in all 50 states. I hope this disturbs you. Only 48% of elected officials could name the 3 branches of government. Now, you took an oath to hold the Constitution. You don't even know how many branches there are. Then how do you maintain separation of powers? That's where you get governors overreaching stuff. That's where you get mayors overreaching stuff. They don't know what constitutional limitations. They have no concept what federalism is, that there's a role for the local government and the state government and the federal government. And so everything becomes nationalized and federalized and mandated, and we don't have a clue. So we've got thorn bushes ruling like crazy. So how do you get rid of thorn bushes? Again, going back to the Bible. There's a great story of, it's not a story, great teaching of the Bible in Exodus 18:21. At this time, Moses is out at the mount, and out at the mount where those 613 laws have been delivered, there's 3 million people gathered around there, and Moses is the only leader. So he's hearing every controversy that's going on, and his father-in-law comes to him and says, "You are crazy, bro. You got to get some help on this." And this was Jethro's recommendation to Moses. He says, you need to provide out all the people, able men, such as fear God, men of truth, hating covetousness, and place such over them to be rulers of thousands, rulers of hundreds, rulers of 50s, rulers of 10s. Notice those bottom 4 lines. Go from the bottom upward. That's choose your local leaders, choose your county leaders, choose your state leaders, choose your federal leaders, thousands, hundreds, 50s, 10s. And what kind of leaders do you want? Go to the top, second line. Able men such as fear God, men of truth, hating covetousness. That's the kind of people you want in office. Let's get those people at all levels. How do you get them? Well, the scripture says you need to provide out. How do you provide out? Well, Moses gave us the rest of the story. He not only talked about this in Exodus 18, over in Deuteronomy 1 and Deuteronomy 16, he says, I took Jethro's word to me as a word from God, and I implemented that. He said, so I went out among you, and I chose out from among you those that fit those qualifications, and I brought them and set them in front of you, and you chose the ones you wanted. In other words, I recruited candidates for office, and you elected candidates for office. But I went out and recruited to make sure we'd have the right kind of choices, right kind of options. What we often have is a choice between the bad and the worst because nobody's really recruiting candidates. I've been in the Republican Party for a long time, and their belief is if you can self-fund, you're the perfect candidate. No, that's not the perfect candidate. You want people with the right values and the right beliefs and the right convictions, everything else. So with that, this is what the story of the Bible is with civil government. How did Saul become the first king? Because the spiritual leader Samuel, God spoke to him and said, that's the guy that needs to be king. And so it was the spiritual leader went over and said, you need to be in civil government. Remember, Saul didn't want to. He went and hid in the baggage. He didn't think he should be in government. Who's the second leader over Israel? It was David. Who chose him? Samuel. And Samuel was quite open. He said, I really thought it was going to be your brother Jonadab because he looks like a king. You're 13 years old, got freckles on your face. I didn't think it'd be you, but God told me you're the guy. And the same thing happened with Solomon, etc. So what happens is you got to have candidates, but this is the last part, is you got to get involved in the elections once you get good people on the ballots. And I want to finish with Charles Finney. He's a revivalist in the Second Great Awakening. We're told that in 1 year, Charles Finney led 100,000 people to Christ in just 1 year. Now, he also had a university where the students at his university, the first university in America that treated blacks and whites, men and women as equals. You could not be in his university if you did not actively participate in trying to overthrow the fugitive slave law. You had to be involved in the Underground Railroad to be a student at his university, and it was out of his university that so much the Underground Railroad took off. It was out of his university that so much opposition to the fugitive slave law came. I mean, he's actively involved. And he wrote a book in 1835 on how to have revival. It was his belief that you don't just pray and get revival. You do things and get revival. He said, if you look in the Bible, God says, and let me give you an example. You know it, 2 Chronicles 7:14. If my people, which are called by my name, will do this, this, and this, then I will do this. Well, if you want this stuff over here, don't pray for it. Just do this stuff over here. Because he says, if you'll do this, I'll do this. And Charles Finney went through the Bible and found all these if-then verses. If you do this, I'll do this. He says, you want a revival? You can bring a revival. Just start doing this stuff here on the if, and then God will do the then, if he'll do that. And so that's what he taught. And in one of the lectures, lecture number 15, look what he said as how to have a revival. Based on biblical teaching, how do you have a revival? And this is what he said. He said, the church must take right ground in regard to politics. He said, politics are part of a religion in a country such as this. What do you mean they're part of a religion? Because we're a stewardship government. God says, here, I'm giving you the American government. You guys take
take care of it till I get back. It's a stewardship thing. It's what we see in Luke 19, Matthew 25. He gave it to him and says, take care of it till I get back. So he says, I've given you government. So that's why he says that politics are part of religion in the country is this, and Christians must do their duty to their country as part of their duty to God. It's just stewardship. He said, God will bless or curse this nation according to the course that Christians take in politics. That's pretty powerful. Here's what's interesting. That was revival lecture number 15, which was called Hindrances to Revival. In other words, if you don't want a revival to come, then stay out of politics. Wow, that's not what we've been hearing. But again, we don't know our own history. Even up through the World War I era, we were actively believing this. This is the way it was from the very beginning with the Pilgrims and the Puritans and the others. This is what we've done for 340 years, and suddenly in the last 60 or 70, we've decided it should be different. You got to get back to the foundational stuff. So that's what I want to challenge you with, particularly just look around you locally. See what you can do locally, because that's where the changes will be made. And I'm telling you, there's local stuff going on across the United States I have never seen in my life. I've got a lot more white hair than a lot of you do, and I've seen a lot of stuff, and I'm seeing something happening now at the local level that I think is really super helpful for America. Doesn't mean it's going to be easy. The other side is entrenched. They're dug in, and they don't tend to give up easily. We've seen the stuff they'll do. That's all right. God wins this thing if his people get involved. So thank you guys for letting me share. Matt, back to you, bro. And by the way, if this is new for you, if this is history you haven't heard out front, we've got a book called The American Story, which goes through a lot of this and documents it. Again, we have the original footnotes, original documents, so it's footnoted. Learn America's history. It'll really give you a lot more boldness and perspective. Thanks, Matt.
Man, I want you to know I really appreciate all of you being here tonight. I know it was an encouragement. I know it was a longer night than you anticipated, but you got two for the price of one, right? You got the video and the live teaching. A couple things I want to say. First of all, I saw several pastors from our community. I saw Richard. Thank you, Zeiser. I'm so glad you came tonight. And I saw some pastors and some faith leaders here. I'm so thankful that you're here tonight. I saw several elected officials. I saw Glenn back there in the back, and I'm so glad that you're here. One of our state assemblymen, and I saw Victoria was here today. Where's Victoria? Seaman was here a little bit earlier. One of our city councilmen, women. And then our Secretary of State is with us tonight. And so I appreciate Barbara. Thank you so much for being here. This man always encourages me. This man always encourages me, and I started watching him on TV about 30 years ago. And any resources that are out there in the lobby, I hope you'll pick up one of those on your way out. And he's going to be around for a few moments, but we've got to get him out because his partner, Chad, has already gone to the airport. They're leaving tonight, but him and his wife are here for a little while. I hope that you'll greet them. Thank you so much, Dr. Barton. Thank you for your investment in our country.
Gotta say, I speak at a lot of places, and I told you that 2.8% of pastors get involved. I use Matt and Dave as examples of what churches are supposed to do. And I literally use this church across the nation talking about here's how a church makes a difference in community. A lot of times I'll ask pastors, if you got up on Sunday morning and you announced to the church you're shutting down, on Monday morning would civic officials be beating on your door saying, don't shut down, you're too valuable? No, a lot of churches are not essential at all. I mean, they literally aren't. And so you guys, with your pastors you've got here, the leadership you've got, you have been such an impact in the community. You're part of that 2.8%. You really need to appreciate your pastor and your leadership.
And you should appreciate all of the nursery workers who have been taking care of the kids for the last 2 hours. So let's thank the Lord for a good evening, and then we'll be dismissed. Father, thank you for the privilege of being in your house tonight and the lessons that we've learned. May we take the knowledge that we've given. I pray that even right now you'd place on some people's hearts the need for them to run for office, to take the responsibility, the stewardship that you've given us, and let them know, yeah, they can do it, and they should do it. Father, wherever we are, even this week as we're looking at a Harvest Sunday where we're just going to share Jesus with people on Sunday, may we take the responsibility of that stewardship to have guests in services even this Sunday. Bless us now, give us safety, and use us to be a light for you in this city and around the world. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Thanks for coming. You're dismissed.